After receiving dozens and dozens of requests for this video, I finally decided to put it together. How to paint shipping containers. Yes, I know so many of you have been out there waiting for this one, and here it is, finally. So what we're looking at here is a shipping container from the Reaper Bones line. And now this isn't the soft PVC plastic that most of the Reaper Bones is made out of. This is actually hard plastic. And the good thing about this, it's only about $8. So if you're looking for some terrain for your modern or future war games, check out the Reaper Bones storage containers. And they got a few other items that may interest you as well. So we're going to be playing around with some mainly weathering techniques on this thing. The first thing we want to do is rough it up a little bit. I want to put a few dings and dents into the sides, and we're doing that with a fairly rough file, a half circle file, and just putting in some nicks and burrs and rounding off some edges here and there. You know, just a little bit of wear. I don't want to go overboard on this. After primering, we can move straight on to the painting, which we're going to be using the airbrush for most of this. And airbrushing with a mix of Minitaire paints from Badger. This is Lagoon Blue. For some reason I can't say that word. Mixed with a little bit of blood-stained mud. And the blood-stained mud is a brown. It's made to darken the blue, to essentially muddy it up a bit so it's not clean and shiny. I do want a little bit of weathering on this item. For the highlights, I'm mixing in some Minitaire Dusty Ground, which is a warm gray, and again we're using that instead of just like white because we want to keep a dull appearance to this for that weathered outdoors look. And I'm highlighting towards the bottom. Normally I would do it towards the top, but I'm just kind of playing around with highlights. I'm going for that bit more of that reverse cartoony contrast that's becoming more popular nowadays, so decided to try that. Normally I would highlight, of course, on the top, but playing around, and it kind of makes sense for this. More of the weathering would be on the bottom where it's on the ground. Maybe more water and dirt would get in contact with the lower portions and fade the paint more. Let's go with that, shall we? Sure. I highlighted 3 more times, each time mixing in a little bit more of the Badger Minitaire Dusty Ground, and each time moving lower and lower and more towards the corners of the container. In order to get a nice crisp contrast line along the top of the container, simply used a folded piece of paper as a guide and highlighted the top part of the container, the lid. And could use tape for this, of course, but if I were to use tape, I would have to let all the previous paint dry a couple hours so it wouldn't peel back up. Piece of paper, easy peasy, did it all in just a few minutes. To amp up the contrast even more, adding a bit of edging along the container, using a mix of Vallejo steel gray mixed with white, and just sort of slightly stippling it along the edges. Again, trying to create a somewhat broken pattern to show wear and weathering. And so just kind of pressing the brush along the edges. Now we get to do the fun stuff, which is all the weathering. And we're starting off with Vallejo Panzer Ace's Dark Rust, and applying that with a makeup sponge. Just get yourself one of those little triangle makeup sponges. You can get a huge pack of them for just a few dollars. Tear off one end and just start stippling on some rusty colored paint. And you want to keep continuously turning the sponge in your hand so you don't get the same pattern repeated over and over. If you press a little bit harder, you'll get a larger rust splotch. But mainly we're just doing a light dabbing here, little bits of rust. I don't want to rust this thing up too much. Actually, I think in the end I may have gone a little bit overboard, but your personal taste as to how much you want to rust these things up. Next, going back again with the Panzer Ace's Dark Rust, and using a brush this time, essentially I'm just kind of connecting the dots here. Wherever I want a bit more rust, I'm stippling it on some more, mainly in the areas where I have to concentrate a lot of the stippling from the sponge. And again, trying to keep it a rough pattern, almost purposefully shaking my hand so I get a kind of haphazard jabbing motion and doesn't end up looking like an obvious repeated pattern of rust. After applying the dark rust, it's time for a little bit of lighter, fresh rust, and for that using Panzer Ace's light rust mixed in with the dark rust. And this is an orangey, fresh rust, something that wouldn't be an old rust, so we're putting this on the outside areas of the dark rust that we did previously to signify the rust spreading from that central area. The outside, the further out you go, the fresher the rust is. So doing, once again, little stipplings with it here and there, concentrating around the areas where there were more rust damage. And also I did go back with the sponge, and I did a little bit of light sponging with the, ironically, light rust as well. The last thing to do with the rust is to highlight some of the larger chips, and for that we are using, once again, the steel gray and white combination we use to highlight the edges of the entire container, and just going on the bottom side of some of the larger rust chips and trying to do a very thin line to give the idea there's some depth there to those rust chips, that they're sunk into the paint, the paint's pulling away, sunk into the metal and the paint's pulling away, excuse me. So this is only possible to do on the larger ones. Obviously the spotted areas we did with the sponge, not going to be able to highlight like this, but whatever we can do adds to the look of the rust to make it look more realistic. For the metal handles and locking bars, we're starting off with Vallejo Model Air Gun Gray mixed with a little bit of the previously used dark rust and with a little bit of black, and just blocking in all those metal bits right now. To that previous mixture, I then added some Vallejo Model Air steel and trying to highlight it just by stippling on this color. I want a broken mottled pattern over the metal, so just little taps of the brush here, there, everywhere. So it's not a smooth, same uniform coat over everything. And finally, we finish it off by giving it 2 stippling glaze coats, first with the Panzer Ace's Dark Rust, and then when that's dry with the Panzer Ace's Light Rust. And so finally we get a nice broken up, non-uniform coat over the whole thing that really looks like a good corroded metal. After a gloss varnish coat, we are ready to apply some decals. And the kit does not come with decals. However, the one benefit of being a really crappy model builder is you have a lot of leftover decals for kits that you've destroyed over the years. So I just dug into my decal box and pulled out some warning and various stickers that I thought would be appropriate for a shipping container and applied those. Not as easy as it sounds though, because of the ribbed surface area. Very hard to get decals around that ribbed texture. So hard to put on. Had put several coats of gloss varnish on after them to keep them in place. And also I wanted to do decals for the sides, but unfortunately that just didn't work out. I actually made my own decals in hopes of putting them on the sides, but unfortunately homemade decals extremely delicate and I just couldn't get them to stick without ripping onto that ribbed side surface of the storage container. So had to go back and paint them instead, and I found this unknown logo on Google. Never heard of this before, but I thought it looked kind of neat and decided to use it. So I just printed it out onto some card paper, and now we're cutting a mask so we can airbrush, stencil airbrush on this logo instead of going with the decal. After cutting the stencil out, all we have to do is tape it into place on the side of the container, and doing the orange first, undercoated with some beige to bring it up so I wouldn't have to put as many coats of orange over it, and trying to press the the stencil down as best I can in order to minimize the amount of paint that's going to get underneath the stencil. This is a textured surface, so trying to get it perfect is not going to be possible here. And like previously done, instead of waiting for the paint to dry and then putting tape over it to mask it, instead I just used little bits of paper held in place with tape, and that way I could finish this much faster instead of waiting for hours for that orange to dry, and just spraying black on the rest of the W logo. I did have quite a bit of cleanup work to do after pulling up the stencil. Even though I was pressing it down, there was still a lot of paint that got through because of the rib sides of the container. So I had to go back and try to color match that, just mixing up paints the best I could to match them. And after that, I went across it with a bit of Army Painter strong tone wash, just to hopefully blend everything together. Again, the stencil was Plan B, and Plan B also didn't work out that well. If I were to do this again, I would probably put less highlights on the sides, and so still use the stencil and go back and clean up afterwards. But using less highlights would mean it would be easier to match the colors, because I had 3 different colors I had to match going down the sides of the container. And there you have it. We have come to the end of the shipping container painting guide. I hope now people stop bugging me on how to paint shipping containers. There you are. That's how you do it. Now, I went fairly rusty on mine, which was not my intention. I actually wanted a very clean container, and I just kind of went overboard with the rust. I realize that now at the end. You can go further with the rust if you want, or bring it back. Shipping containers that are actually in use tend not to get this rusty because they're protected and they cost money and the owners want to use them. But, you know, an abandoned shipping container I'm sure would get a lot more rusty. Or I want to do graffiti on one, but again, the issue with the ribbed sides would make that difficult, and also I wanted a fresher container. But you can play around with it as much as you can. The only issue I see is the sides of the container. Trying to put some sort of logo or something on it is a bit difficult because of the rib surface. Kind of wish Reaper backed off on that and used something a bit smoother. I think have a lot more opportunities for painting. But, well, there you go. How to paint shipping containers. Only one of these on YouTube, I bet you.